Seahawks fans, wherever you may be. Welcome back for another edition of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. Join your host, Bill Alvstad, and co-host, sports writer and football analyst Keith Myers, as we talk Seahawks football.
Seahawks fans, welcome back to another episode of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Bill Alvstad, sitting down with co-host Keith Myers, here to talk Seahawks football, post-draft, analyzing all the picks, evaluating what they did, and whether we liked it or not, and how the roster kind of comes together after the draft, and so on and so forth. Welcome in, man.
Yeah, it's an interesting year. So last year, of course, they found 6 key guys with a couple others that have a chance to develop into significant players. This year, obviously we have to wait to see who that is and what happens. But last year was a very high bar to try and get over, and I'm looking at this list of guys, and I'm not sure they did, but they got some really interesting and a couple of really, really good players, even if they're not at positions where the Seahawks needed to improve.
Yeah, like you said, last year, Keith, we gave the Seahawks an A grade for the 2022 draft class pretty much right after the draft, without seeing the results on the field, just because we thought, based on the way the draft fell, draft needs lined up with best players available, and it just seemed like the draft flowed to the Seahawks in Seattle's favor without hardly any effort at all. It just kind of, the board fell and we made the picks, and the results were self-evident. Mm-hmm. This year, I thought it didn't fall as easy as it did last year for sure, but I thought they pivoted and made the best choices at the spots that they could have at the time for me. Like, for example, the first round, I know that everyone, going into the draft mentally was ready for them to really attack and address the primary needs on the roster, that being defensive line, offensive line, interior, in the trenches, essentially. Mm-hmm. And they came out of the first round addressing needs that were lower on the list. We did the needs show prior to the draft where our current roster evaluation was. And both those picks address needs further on down the list, which led to some disappointment and a large discussion with us about what that really meant and if those were great values or not. In retrospect, now looking back on the whole draft as a whole, I kind of appreciate what the Seahawks did at the top of the draft, knowing that they did have to pivot. I know that they were probably going to choose. And I happened though was pretty with. I know they really had an interest, and he was not there when I was the player available. Blue players in the draft, and just a handful for me. Devon Witherspoon, the cornerback, I think he comes in immediately and has a very large impact on the roster. Kind of turns a pretty solid, good cornerback room into an elite cornerback room for me. And I think come out of the first round and get a position group on your team up to elite status. I think that's a win for the Seattle. And then with the second pick, did the same thing in the wide receiver room for a long time, having a third wide receiver option in this offense. We did that. And so for me, I really thought they knocked it out of the park in the first round. Given the value of those positions and the impact that we'll have on the roster. And then they came back later on and addressed some of the other stuff too. So I felt pretty good about it.
Well, cornerback was one of 2 positions on this roster, on this team, that if they did not get a player, there was no issue, right? If they didn't get a cornerback and they didn't get a tight end, everyone would be like, cool, the roster's set anyway. So for them to use the 5th overall pick on one of those 2 positions was very confusing. Witherspoon's a great player. He's a great player. He's going to come in and make an immediate impact. but that's a huge investment in terms of the fifth overall pick, right? That's a lot of capital spent on one of two positions where they absolutely did not need another body. And that's the part that really confused me about it. I mean, I'm not in any way disparaging Witherspoon. He's a great prospect. He's a guy that's going to come in. Um, he's going to come into rookie minicamp as the starter opposite Woolen, and that's in a cornerback room that has Mike Jackson, who played really well last year. Trey Brown, the draft pick from the year before, who played really well before he got hurt, and Kobe Bryant, who is also a draft pick from last year, a key contributor last year, who is looking to take a step forward and carve out a larger role. Witherspoon's still the day one. He is the starter as of right now, and he hasn't even put on a Seahawks uniform yet. So great player, but just confusing pick in that why would you go to the one position or one of two positions where you absolutely don't need a guy? With the second pick there in the first round, Smith Najigma, again, love the player, probably the best receiver in the draft. And by probably, I mean, at least within the draft process, considered the best receiver in the draft now. There's always someone who just never lives up to the hype, and other people who, were taken in the rounds 2 or 3 that you're all of a sudden you're like, wow, these guys are really good. Tyler Lockett comes to mind. But at the same time, like, okay, with that pick, pick's a little more understanding in that you had Kancey. Kalijah Kancey sitting there, and we thought he was going to be available, and then he got sniped at pick 19. And with him gone, it was like, okay, do you trade down? Do you reach for Mozzie Smith, or do you take the best wide receiver in the draft? And they chose to take the best wide receiver in the draft, and I'm not going to fault them for that, given that they needed wide receiver. That was one of those positions that, yeah, it wasn't first or second on the priority list, but I think it was third. And or at least you and I kind of disagreed with where that fell, but whatever. You know what I mean? It was right there.
Sure. And I think that points to their overarching philosophy, both those picks, in that they were going to go for best player available. Now, they talked specifically in the news conference that they had after the first round about how the draft just didn't fall for them correctly, and they had a couple of disappointments essentially out of that. And I think one of them was Richardson not falling to them at 5, and then not either getting adequate draft compensation to drop back, or they just really felt conviction with the Witherspoon pick. And if you listen to everything they say, and you take it with a grain of salt a little bit, but nonetheless, they were very effusive on their praise with Witherspoon and how he fits and what they plan to do with him and how aggressive he was. He was just kind of a special player. If you read between the weeds, according to what Pete Carroll said, this guy was almost a generational talent at that spot, and they virtually almost had no choice but to select him there. And then with Najigba, I think that's a great value pick for Seattle. Again, best wide receiver in the draft, in my opinion, immediately locks down that number 3 wide receiver spot. A chain mover for sure, but just more than that, he can complete the wide receiver room in Seattle, and eventually supplant possibly Tyler Lockett as the go-to target for Geno or another quarterback, into the future. And I think you start to address those sorts of needs with players of this stature. As you look at Tyler Lockett aging in the system and so forth, he's great right now, but that aging process can happen overnight. And so I really love that pick. This is where it kind of gets squirrely for both of us in this draft. In going into the second round, day 2, I think I like the picks better than you on the whole, and I think they will have a great impact on the roster. But we can talk about them individually just a little bit. Derek Hall, what they called the edge rusher, he's more of a base defensive end out of Auburn with the pick number 37 in the second round. Speed to power guy, alpha dog, a great culture guy, a good leader. Those attributes, I think, is what really tipped the scales for Seattle. You had mentioned when we had discussions about after the pick about going out and watching some game film on him immediately and being less than impressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's enough attributes there that I saw, as well as taking a look at all of the accumulated things that have been said about him as far as in scouting reports and so forth, praising the pick. I think that there's enough there to work for that I think he can have an impact right away. I think that, he's got some tools and now they just need to be refined. And I believe in the coaching staff that's going to be able to do that. What is giving you some pause here on the pick?
Well, I watched every single snap he played of the game against Alabama, right as soon as they made the pick. And he made 3 plays in that entire game. One was someone else tipped a pass and he turned around and was able to catch it. There was one where he dove inside and made a stop on a running play, and another one where he was able to get around on the edge and get a sack. The rest of the game, he was a complete no-show. Didn't generate pressure. Didn't get to the quarterback in any way. And I know when because we watched day 2 together, you were telling me, well, it's Alabama, that's really good, good team. Do you think they're going to be less good in the NFL? No, they're going to be better.
The only thing that I would, pause on with that is it's a 1-game sample. A and B, it's Alabama. C, we don't know if he was injured, had an injury, or had any sort of impact at all in the game. I know that he ended up with 7 or 8 sacks in the season, tons of pressures. He's got this, he went to the combine, kind of knocked it out of the park. There's a lot to like there, and I don't know that I would take 1 game and kind of turn my my entire thought process on its head with him. But I get that though.
I then went and did the same exact thing against Missouri, which is not Alabama. It's kind of the opposite of Alabama in the SEC. And watched him play there, and again, it was a lot of nothing. I mean, as a run defender, he's really good. He sets an edge very well.
He's one of the best run
defenders. He plays very smartly against the run, sets an edge. But he's an edge player. He's a pass rusher. Get to the freaking quarterback. And I did not see him do that even against Missouri. And it just gives me pause, because I think what you're drafting here is a combine guy who just wasn't dominant. He was not a dominant player. He didn't look special in either of those 2 games, and that makes me worry. So, I mean, it really comes down to, you look at Darrell Taylor, who's kind of struggled
and other games,
a little bit, and he's been very, he looked really dominant. And then there are times as a pro where that starts to show up. Hall never did in any of the games that I watched. So,
yeah, fair. And when you watch every snap in every game, that's other than watching highlights for sure. I went out and just watched some highlights this morning on him, just because I just didn't have time to dive in on the prospect. But there was a lot to like there, and he did show up in quite a few of those, and some of those highlights were 10, 12 plays in a game where he showed up. And so maybe I have hope for the pick. I like the pick. It's an area where Seattle may have on paper anyway looked sufficiently stacked at that spot this season, but I think overall, when you add to the pile, and you said it yourself, you can't have enough.
You never have too many pass rushers.
He's part of that rotation, and he gets into the system. And I really like the idea of what they talked about as far as his alpha dog mentality and his leadership qualities that he would bring to the team. I think that's really important, and that's one of the things. The cultural aspect of this pick, I think, is really important to Seattle. And so I like that for that reason as well. All right, let's talk about the second pick.
Actually, I wanted to go back to that, because We don't know what scheme they're going to run next year. Are they going to stay with the 3-4, the bare front kind of situation where they had last year, or are they going to go back to the 4-3, the way Richard Sherman said that they were planning on, even though no one else has confirmed what Sherman said. If they go back to the 4-3, Derek Hall becomes a Sam linebacker, not a defensive end, and he basically is um, Bruce Irvin during his first tenure with Seattle. In that role, Derek Hall can be very good.
So you
I
don't think he
honestly
would
think
be
he can
more
be
of a
very good.
Cliff Averill type player?
No, no, I didn't see any of that on the tape.
I mean, he ran
Um,
a 4.55 40 and had a 1.55 split, and
yeah,
showed some
that sounds a
explosiveness in
lot like
his testing.
that sounds a lot like Bruce Irvin.
Yeah, but he's 256 as that's a little heavy to be a Sam, don't you think?
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay,
Um,
interesting. Okay, so let's talk about Zach Charbonnet. So for
okay.
me, one of my favorite prospects out of the draft, regardless of where he's chosen. I know that there's that thing. I just want to like get that out of the way. Yeah, he's a running back. We chose Walker in a similar area in the draft last year. For me, here's my argument for him in that when you take a look at Walker as your 1A running back on the roster, they didn't have a 1B on the roster. Uh, Second point, when you take a look at Walker, he was injured all last offseason prior to training camp. So he came in to the rookie camp, was nicked up, injured, couldn't really participate, didn't participate a ton in training camp for various reasons. Kind of then started behind the 8 ball at the beginning of the season. Rashad Penny was there. He took the bulk of the carries. Walker really didn't have an impact on any games really until game 5, game 6, and he ended up being great. But I would think that the team views this position obviously more importantly than most teams in the NFL. There are, as the NFL running back thing goes, it's really important to have starting caliber tandem in the NFL now. There's really very few teams that operate just on one running back. So to get that important position locked up with a very good, talented player is good. Now, yeah, we could have waited until the 7th round. We did. We got Kenny McIntosh with the last pick, but Kenny McIntosh is not the same running back as Zach Charbonnet, and I think would have a not as an impactful result as a player on the field if he was to take snaps full time. I think Zach Charbonnet is a perfect fit for this offense. Between the tackles guy, very powerful, elusive, has a great juke move on him. He's a great receiver out of the backfield. I would argue almost that Zach Charbonnet is a better fit at running back than Ken Walker in this system, and could possibly end up having more carries by the end of the season than Ken Walker, and Ken Walker becomes the complimentary back. That's how good this guy is.
Yeah, I know you really like him. I'm trying really hard to come up with a way to criticize this particular pick other than the other guys that were available and the bigger needs. But the truth is, as far as player goes, yeah, I can't criticize that. As far as waiting until pick 52 to get a running back, I am not really going to criticize that either. I like the pick. I mean, that was where a guy like John Michael Schmitz or Luke Weipler or
Yeah, right,
any of those centers. I think Osiris Torrance was still available at that point. Like
right,
they
right.
they could they could have made a major impact on in the trenches where they still need help. But the truth is, Charbonnet is a great fit. It does fill a need. They needed a running back. Do they need a? They didn't need a bell cow starter because they have Walker, but they needed a piece that they could put in because if Walker gets hurt, you got to have the guy that can step in, and also you just want rotation. You want to have two guys at the position at all times, and they filled that role. He's done, and I really can't criticize him in any way. Just like the 2 first-round picks, just a fantastic player that makes an instant impact. There's a guy from Texas that you really really like that they could have
Yeah,
had much later. That
much later.
I think could have also had filled that same role. In terms of what the Seahawks were looking to do, and it would have freed them up at this point to get a trench guy, which they needed. But he's a special player. Let's just say that he's a special guy. So
so originally Seattle had the 3rd round pick and number 83 overall. Ended up trading out of that pick back to the 4th round pick 108 overall, and also picked up a 3rd round pick in 2024. If you go look at the draft trade charts and all that stuff where you can estimate value of the trade, we knocked it out of the park.
this is a fleecing by Seattle of Denver. I mean, there's no way to spin this in any other way. Would have been like the Seahawks. There was a lot of good players available when the Seahawks would have picked. And so it would have been nice to get one of those guys. But in terms of the grand scheme of things, they generated a 4th round pick out of nothing, out of thin air. Because
a third round, not a 4th, a 3rd.
No, a 4th round pick. Because you take their 3rd round this year, trade it for a 3rd round next year.
True. Yeah.
Which are going to be in the same range. It's not like it's going to be but they traded a 3rd round pick in the 60s for what's going to be a 3rd round pick in the 80s. Now they're both going to be about the same spot in the draft. And they got a 4th round pick for free by doing that. And so they literally just generated the 6th pick in the 4th round out of thin air for doing this. And they increased their draft capital next year, which just helps. It just helps as they continue to build this roster.
And by all accounts, a superior draft class overall next year. Okay. So with that first pick in the 4th round that we had, 108 overall, we chose Anthony Bradford out of LSU, offensive guard, big guy, mauler, kind of I thought one of the best, if not the best mauling guard in this draft. Needs to work on his footwork a little bit, but Andy Dickerson's his coach. Seemed to work out last year with the 2 tackles we got. He slides in next to Abraham Lucas. I think competes right away with Phil Haynes for that starting spot. I think that's how good he is. I personally had him as a kind of a 3rd round grade. To able to get him there in the 4th round, I thought is good value, and I think he comes in right away. And you and I talk about this a little bit as far as impact on the roster and able to compete. He's at least competing for that spot and can come in and really have a nice impact right away.
Yeah, he's a guy that I think it's going to come down to camp and who gets hurt and who is on the field every day and that kind of stuff. But him and Phil Haynes are very similar players, and like extremely similar players. And they're competing for the same job. And when it comes down to it, if they're very similar players and they're very similar skill, you want the younger guy to win. So we'll hope that happens. He's a guy that, he's very similar to Phil Haynes. He's going to have very similar abilities and strengths and weaknesses. He's a guy, he's massive. He's just a huge mauler in there, can take defensive tackles and drive them backwards. But he's a guy that is designed to play in a phone booth. He doesn't have the lateral agility. He doesn't have the foot speed. And in a zone scheme, that might be a liability, where he can't just latch onto the guy in front of him and push him straight backwards. You're asking to push him sideways and that kind of stuff. And against as a pass blocker, he's going to have a little bit of liability to really good gap penetrators on either side of him. and or people that running a twist or a stunt where he's got to react and pick up the faster footed guy coming through. This is all more about, like, the team's got to know what they have. They do, and they've got to make sure to account for these things when they're calling plays and designing blocking schemes, and making sure that they have line calls called in a way that don't put him on an island where he's going to fail. And they can do that. I mean, they did that with Phil Haynes in the past. They did that especially, in the game when you have um, um, the right tackle. God, why can I not remember his name?
Gabe Lucas.
Curhan. When Curhan came
Curhan.
inside and came in and played right tackle because both the other two guys were hurt, he's very similar in terms of, like, just his liabilities as a blocker. And so just being able to go in and kind of just set that and make sure that they're accounting for that, they can do. And if they do those things, which they've shown every indication that they're willing to, they can get a lot of production out of this guy. He's just a massive human being who pushes people backwards. And
he did have some good solid agility testing at the combine. Ran a 5:08 40, and then his athletic attributes as far as his 3-cone and short shuttle and vertical, all that pointed towards a guy that can kind of get out in space and do it. Maybe it just needs some refinement. I don't know, but
it doesn't show up on his tape at all.
Okay.
It shows up when they try and get him in space. He looks lost. Guys just run around him. He's a phone booth guy, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, because the Seahawks don't pull guards. When they run outside, they run a stretch zone where people stay in their spot, and they don't pull, and so they don't need guys to pull. And in a case like this, where you've got a guy like this, and you need someone up at the second level to block a linebacker, send your center, right? Set up a double team with the guard. Make sure the guard gets engaged, and then the center releases and gets up to the next level and gets on a linebacker. I mean, it doesn't have to be the guard that does it. You can be the center, and oftentimes it's determined, in this scheme, it's determined by the alignment of the defensive player, whether they're, on one shoulder or the other, who's going to be the primary and who's going to be the secondary on that double team. So they can make it work. They really can. I mean, he's got early in Pete Carroll's tenure, it was find guys with unique traits. Don't worry about trying to find complete players, especially later in the draft. Just find guys with unique traits that you can use. And this is very much a unique trait guy. He's an absolute mauler, and take advantage of what he can do. Don't worry about what he can't do. And just philosophically, it's a good pick. And I like the fact that he can come in and at least compete for a job right away.
Yeah, interesting. And this is the first pick that the Seahawks used to address the trenches. And I think it's a good pick. I think he comes in right away and at least is competitive. So we'll see how that goes. How about defensive tackle Cameron Young for round 4, pick 123 overall, our native pick. I like this pick. I've liked him since the Senior Bowl, where he really kind of showed up as a guy that's still only 304, something like that, 304, 6'3", 304. But Clint Hurt on his conference call with him told him to eat. Yeah, bring take in all the calories he can. They want him to beef up a little bit. Sounds like they're going to try to put him at nose tackle in this scheme, and as well as a little bit of 3-tech, but move him inside a little bit and let him compete in there. And we'll see how he does. It seems to me right away the guy is a rotational piece unless Seattle does something to bring in Al Woods or Poona Ford right away. So I think he's going to be ends up being a really good player for Seattle. It may take a little bit of time.
Yeah, I mean, he's a guy with unnaturally long arms, which is great for a defensive lineman because you can keep the offensive lineman off you. Um, he plays a little high with his pad level, which they're going to have to coach out and fix. And if they do that, you're going to see him be even better. Um, I liked this pick. I had him as a third round guy because I thought
Hmm.
his physical attributes were um, going to see him win in a lot of ways, even with technique that was less than optimal. And we've seen Seattle's coaching staff, Clint Hurt and company up front, get guys fixed as far as their like technique and mechanics, so they can really use some of those skills. He's just got power. He's just straight up powerful. Long arms will stop, the lineman from being able to get on him and push him. Instead, he's going to be pushing them. Um, and just a massive guy that just needs some he needs some technique tweaks. And once they get there, he's going to be great. He's a nose tackle. I honestly think that he is not an
His
interior
athletic,
pass
yeah,
rusher.
his athletic profile dictates he's a nose tackle. His
Yeah,
size and weight and length dictate he's kind of a defensive end prospect. But his short shuttle at 17th percentile, and his 10-yard split at 180, and his vertical at 28 and a half, and his broad jump
he's a nose
and
tackle.
three cone, he doesn't have the athletic profile, right? So they want to beef him up a little bit, move him inside full time, and I think that's the
Yep.
right spot. That's the right thing to do with him because he does look like he can be successful there. But it could take a season because
Yeah.
you've got to add the functional strength and weight to kind of bulk
Well,
up a little bit.
as far as core strength and
Yeah,
functional
he's
strength, I think
strong.
he
Yeah,
has it.
yeah,
This is usually when they're like, "Oh, let's build this guy up." It's like, okay, you're going to put a bunch of fat on him, and he's not, but he's going to lose what athleticism he does have. In this case, this guy's got the strength. He's a powerful, powerful dude. They just need to make it harder for other guys to push him. So some of it is going to be, yeah, he's going to have to bulk up. Um, but he's not a guy that I worry about in terms of if he puts on weight by eating rather than by lifting. I'm not worried about it hurting him. So hopefully they can get him
right.
up. They can get him up to weight this year so he can play the position and use it, and then he can use next all off season and next year to convert that mass from fat back into muscle and end up being a guy that's 330 who's fit. And I think at that point he's going to look really, really nice as a nose tackle.
So one of the prospects that I really liked early in the process before the combine was defensive end Mike Morris. We picked him up with our fifth round pick, 151 overall. He was a guy that I looked at as potentially being available, and picking and selecting in the early fourth round with our 123 pick. And then he went to the combine, Keith, and he just had a poor showing. Ran a
Oh, he looked
5.04
terrible.
40 and then a 5.08 40 at his pro day. Um, had 7.5 Big Ten Defensive Lineman of the Year, and you could say that he had the skills, and on film it looked like maybe a top 50 type pick, and then going to the combine and really just ran himself out of the edge spot where he played in college. And now you're looking like you need to bulk up a little bit into the 300 range, which he's doing and has been asked to do by the team, so that he can be a defensive end in a 3-4 front. And so that's, I think, why they picked him. That's where they envision him playing. And I think he has some skill set there to be attractive. But again, this is one of those guys I think you're probably banking on having a larger impact in 2024.
Who is the defensive end from Army? Um, was
Carter.
like, yeah, he was thought of as a second round pick in that range. Then he came into the combine and just
Right.
looked awfully
Similar.
slow.
Andre Carter, I think is what it
Yeah,
was. Yeah.
and just tanked his draft stock. Very similar thing that happened here. Um, I agree with you. I liked Morris pre-combine, just because his tape looks good. 6'5", 275. He's a 5 tech, long arms, and does all the things that you want a 5 tech to do. Like, he's not going to beat you around the corner, um, but he's still quick. He can get inside. He can move people around. He's bulked up to is it like 382 or something like that now. Um, and he's going to
282.
continue to bulk up. 282, yeah, 382, 382. That's 100 pounds in a couple weeks. No, 282. He's working on getting up there. He's probably going to be, um, 295 at the start of camp. People have a hard time keeping the weight on during camp just because of all the work that they do. Probably have a playing weight around 290 this year. He's a great looking 5 tech. And honestly, you look at his tape, and there are times when he looks quick, he looks explosive,
Mm-hmm.
and none of that showed up at the combine. And
the
that's
guy
really
had 35 total pressures, 19 quarterback hurries, 7 QB hits, and 9 sacks playing for Michigan last year. So he's productive, and it shows up on tape. It just didn't show up in the agility testing and straight line speed. So what do you do with that? He looks like he's a real powerful guy. He's a leader on their defense, guy that comes in with high character, and so they're hoping it just translates. And when you texted me last night, you were saying, "Oh, we have a lot of rotational guy and some back end talent in this draft." I think this is the kind of prospect that we're talking about, where
yeah.
it's going to take him a little while to kind of integrate into a new position where he's going to have to learn and learn the defense, and they're going to have to figure out if he can still play at that spot and still have the same effect on a game.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it comes down to this guy. He's kind of got LJ Collier written on him, right? Who was a massive disappointment in Seattle. The difference is, instead of using their first pick in the draft on him, they got him way down in round 5. But he's definitely got an LJ Collier look to him. If he can improve what he does with his hands and do a better job of battling and not letting the offensive lineman, get latch onto him and beat him with that punch, he has a chance to be better and more productive. But they've really got to focus on him, and he'll be one of those guys that if they can get into that MMA stuff that they did a few years ago and really teach people how to use their hands in that way, he could turn out to be a significantly better player.
With his length and strength, I think he's got some upside for sure.
Oh, he absolutely does. So I think LJ Collier is kind of his floor. Like they could plug him in right now, and he could be as useless as, okay, not really, but as LJ Collier was. But you know what I mean? Like he could have that impact today to be what LJ Collier was after 4 years with the team. And he can only get better from there. So ultimately, they lost Collier in the offseason, and by lost, I meant waved to him as he walked away, and they replaced him in the rotation with a guy with more upside. So I didn't mind this pick where it was. I agree with you. I was someone who I thought they would target. Just his combine scores were so weird because they're just absolutely not expected to be that bad.
Right. Kind of crazy. All right, so the next pick, we went back to the well at Michigan, and at 154 chose center Olusum Uluwatimi, the Outland and Remington Award winners in 2022, which goes to the best center and the top interior offensive lineman in college football. And it's interesting because early in this process, in January, February, when I started to look at prospects, and center was going to be a position that we were going to address, he came up, and I was like, why is he projected to be a 4th round guy? I'm not understanding a guy that's winning those awards, has 3,000 snaps under his belt, has been a starter in 3 different programs in college, essentially has started almost every game he's ever played in college, and you're a really smart guy, all that kind of stuff. Why is he lagging back? And maybe we can find that answer. Maybe right now, but sounds like he's limited athletically, but his smarts and technique make up for it.
Well, he is limited athletically. I think that's part of it, and he's more of a technician in terms of he's not just a pure physical guy, but then he makes mistakes with his technique. And so you see plays where um, the nose tackle will actually intentionally wait for him to stand up rather than engage right away. So then they could come forward on him and knock him back, and you can't do that. You got to actually get up and make contact and not have that gap between you, because the Aaron Donalds of the world are going to eat this guy alive until he fixes that. And sometimes, like with twists and stunts, he gets chasing, and he gets himself turned sideways, and um, you can't do that either. You got to be able to move your feet, slide, and keep yourself square, so that way you can have that strength and power. So there are some things he's not very good in space. He gets out in front and doesn't really know what to do. Um, Not much of an issue with in Seattle's scheme because they play zone instead of they don't pull guards like that. It's more just of what does he do when he gets to the second level? Can he locate, find, and make that block on the linebacker and not have the guy just duck their shoulder and run around him? And that might be something that he can they can pick up on and give him some ideas that will help him out. But he's kind of dropped. He doesn't have a super high end athletic profile, and then there's also some mistakes as far as like the way he does stuff and the way he's been taught, which is weird given the awards that he's won and the fact that the Jim Moore Award, which is given to the best offensive line in football, Michigan's won it 2 years in a row. And he's kind of been their leader in the middle of that. And to see some of the technique, just it's like he hasn't been coached that well, which is sad. You know what I mean? Because like the best offensive line 2 years in a row, and he's won all these awards. And so we'll see what happens when he comes in. He is a guy
What's the
that
upside with him, Keith? What's
the
the
upside.
floor? What's the ceiling?
So the floor is probably Austin Blythe, where he just ends up making enough mistakes and doesn't have the athleticism to recover and just gets beat a lot, but is really smart and does stuff. The ceiling for him is, I'm trying to think of a good example.
Justin Britt.
No,
I mean,
it's not.
he's not the same size as Justin Britt. What I'm saying is he would be like a league average center, like
Sure.
ranked 15th to 20th, and
Yeah,
just
I
do
mean,
an
he
adequate
could.
job for you and make all the line calls, which is really important. Get everyone in position, kind of a leadership. He's got that built-in leadership kind of quality about him. So if he
Who was
can win
the
the job, I think he would do well.
who was the center that Seattle brought in to play next to um, in that line next to um,
Like Robbie Toback.
that's the guy I'm thinking. Wow, I couldn't even finish a sentence because I'm trying to come up with the names of all the guys on that line, and I'm like, yeah, Robbie Toback is kind of where I see his ceiling. A guy that um, isn't huge, not super athletic, but plays smart, does stuff well, and just doesn't. You can get him to a point where he just doesn't make that mistake and ends up being an asset um, in the way that he communicates and the way that he gets everybody on the same page at all times. Robbie Tobeck was perfect for what Seattle needed at that moment. Um, of course, he was a veteran by then, but I could see this guy turning into a Robbie Tobeck.
Yeah, could be worse. Could be worse. And then at the end, we finished out with a couple players, round 198 overall, out of New Mexico, and then in round 7, picked 237 overall to end the draft. Running back Kenny McIntosh out of Georgia. I like both those picks. I really like the Kenny McIntosh pick as far as the value that he brings. I thought, at that spot in the draft, there was a lot of players, a lot of big boards out there, consensus big boards that had him in the late third, fourth round as far as a grade. I think he comes in right away, makes the roster, and becomes kind of that homer type running back in Seattle's offense. Catches some balls out of the backfield, special teams guy. Maybe eventually works himself up into a larger role. but we'll see. And then safety Jarek Reed, just kind of a tenacious player on the small side for a safety, but tested very well. One of the probably the third or fourth most athletic safeties in the draft class. But just New Mexico has some issues with certain things, certain aspects of his game that they'll have to work on. But they're hoping he can come in and play special teams right away. In fact, they said so on his conference call.
Yeah, I like the running back in that he's different than what they've got. He's not just another. Um, he's not just another between the tackles pounder. He's a third down back. He's Travis Homer. If he had run faster instead of being in the 4.6 range, if he had run in the 4.4 range, he would have been a third round pick. Because he's got that.
Correct.
He's got that production, that smarts, the agility. A guy that you don't want him running between the tackles a lot because he's just not that guy. But he's a guy that can catch the ball out of the backfield. You can line him up in the slot if you run him out there from the backfield to the slot in order to create some mismatches. He's an interesting player, very Travis Homer-esque. And having lost Homer in the offseason, they just replaced him. So I like that. As far as the safety goes, yeah, high football IQ guy. No idea about his overall athleticism because he wasn't a combine invite. Does take some weird angles to some passes, to some runners, which you don't like to see, but and doesn't tend to go up and contest balls in like 50-50 situations all that well because he mistimes things a lot. So those are the kind of the drawbacks with him. But he's a guy that, he was playing at New Mexico. It's a low, quality of opponent, low quality of play. He's going to need some coaching, some time to develop. He's going to be a special teamer right away with a chance to become a more productive player down the road.
So Seattle also went out and signed just a ton of undrafted rookie free agents. Haven't had a chance to completely look at that class yet. A couple names stand out. Noah Grindorf, the tight end out of North Dakota State, has some athletic upside. Jonathan Sutherland, safety, is a bigger safety, box type safety. I thought was interesting. Matt Landers, wide receiver out of Arkansas, is a bigger prospect who runs very fast. So he's into the like a 6'4", 208 and runs like in a 4.37, 4.38 40. So that's a very interesting type prospect. Straight
line runner with that size, that speed. He'll just be out there sprinting down the sideline, taking the top off the defense and forcing the free safety to relocate. That's and you know what? You need the guys like that. There's some nice guys. There's some other interesting names on there, but I think we'll talk about that in another show.
Yeah, for sure. I think, overall, Keith, when you factor in what we did in free agency, we added Dramont Jones, we got Bobby Wagner back, Julian Love, Jerron Reed. We went in the draft. I think, as the draft finished, we were able to address some of those trench positions, interior defensive line and offensive line, as well as round out some different prospects. I came away really liking this draft. And I think the roster is definitely improved. I'm probably a little more bullish on it than you are as far as thinking that there's going to be maybe 5 selections out of this draft that will have an impact in 2023, and a solid impact. And to me, I think that the overall, I would probably give this draft a B+ to A-. There are other services out there, like ESPN, PFF, etc., who are giving this draft class an A. I'm more of a wait and see, just because of some of those middle level prospects that we talked about. I think if they get their center to in fact turn out and beat out Evan Brown for the starting center role, and they get Cameron Young to come in right away and have an impactful rotation role there at the nose tackle position. And maybe a guy like Derek Hall turns out a little better than the tape against Alabama, then to me, this draft class is a home run hit for sure.
Yep. It might, and it might just be role, getting Derek Hall into the right role. as it was with Bruce Irvin when they tried to have him be an edge rusher and come off the edge, it didn't work well. But when they moved him into Sam linebacker and allowed him to, he became an every down player. And that's the kind of thing that if they make Derek Hall a Sam linebacker, I think he could be a better player than he showed in college. But if they're asking him to just be that pin your ear back and go guy, it doesn't show up on his tape.
And they have talked about possibly having him bulk up a little bit and move inside. Not a lot, but enough to where he can, be up into the 270 range, depending on the hybrid type defense they do roll out.
Yeah,
they could have,
It comes down to the scheme.
Yeah.
Obviously, like Witherspoon's a Pro Bowl level cornerback. Is how he's viewed.
Day one starter. Yep.
Day one starter. Smith and Najigma is your third receiver day one, and since teams run three receivers more than any other package, that's a starter. After that, though, there's a lot of backups, right? Derek Hall at this moment is Uchenna Nwasu's backup. Zach Charbonnet is at this moment Ken Walker's backup. Anthony Bradford will have to beat out Phil Haynes, so and there's no guarantee he's going to do that. He's kind of a backup guard. Cameron Young is not ready to be a starting nose tackle at this point, so you're going to see a lot of Brian Monet on early downs, or Jerron Reed, and then Cameron Young will just be a rotational piece.
I think it's going to end up being Poona Ford. I think they're on the phone with Poona Ford right now, trying to negotiate a 1-year deal for sure.
I hope so. Because putting Poona Ford back into this scheme, he got Cameron Young, learning from him, that would be amazing. Mike Morris is going to be
a project,
a backup to Dre Jones at the 5 tech. Right, there's a lot of backups. Only a couple of guys that are going to make get on the field a lot. That's Witherspoon and Smith Najigma. Now, that is given these players on Seattle's current roster. That isn't really the reason why ESPN and them are saying that Seattle won this draft and they got an A and all of that is because they got the best cornerback in the draft. They got the best wide receiver in the draft. They've got a project defensive end who has really, really high upside.
Probably the second or third best running back.
Yeah, I would say the number 3 running back in the entire draft. They got a guard which is limited to some teams but fits Seattle pretty well, and has a high upside. They got a nose tackle that other teams would kind of be like, but fits Seattle's defense as long as you give him time to develop. Same with Morris at defensive end. Same with Oluwatimi at center. So you look not this year, but a year from now, at going into the 2024 season, and you're going to have this draft class is going to look better going into the 2024 season than it does right now. So I can criticize and I can be that because it makes for fun banter on this show. But the truth is, this is a good draft, and
it points to a rebuilding team. It points to a team that's rebuilding, and they're adding character and leadership qualities to the team, as well as didn't reach in this draft. I didn't think for any player really. And kind of drafted for best player available. I mean, you could argue the Charbonnet thing, but that's where he was expected. In fact, he was expected to go slightly earlier than that.
That wasn't a reach at all.
No. What I'm saying though is overall they didn't reach for any prospects.
No, they didn't.
But they, what I'm saying on the Charbonnet is you could argue, and you did earlier, that it could have been another position of greater need, but they really didn't philosophically approach the draft that way, and I kind of like the way that it rolled out. I really do. I like all the players. I think it's wait and see on anything past the third round there, the fourth round through seventh round. It's wait and see. I mean, they look good on paper, but you're right. Bradford. Well, let's see how he matches up and competes for that starting spot. Oluwatimi. Same thing. Let's find out if Evan Brown really, is hungry, proves his stuff, and comes in and wants to take that spot, or if this guy, based on the fact he started 3.5 years, 4 years worth of college football is comes in with that mindset and is going to take that spot. That would be fantastic for me if this guy won that.
Yeah.
And then down, everyone else we just talked about for sure.
I mean, it comes down to, you're right, they did not reach. In the past, they've reached for position quite a bit. That's how you ended up with LJ Collier on this roster. And, some
And
of that, they didn't
Rashad
reach.
Penny and Christian Michael, and the list goes on and on.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't reach for anyone. They sat there, they got good value at every spot along the thing. And you can argue, okay, there were other guys, and that would have helped this team more in 2023 that were available. But, if you were to not take Smith Najigma and instead take Mozzie Smith, yeah, you know what? That makes the team better in 2023, but it certainly doesn't make the team better in 2024 in the same way that Smith Najigma will. They just need to figure out how to fill the roster with talent, not just bodies, but talent in the positions where they needed to get guys and didn't. You mentioned Poona Ford. Getting him on this roster is a necessity. Or maybe Al Woods. Maybe Shelby Harris. They need some bodies there. They need another interior lineman that they trust. They need to go find the cap space to sign these guys. It would have been nice if they'd picked them up in the draft, but they didn't. And instead, they got players that long term will be major impactful guys. They just may not have that same impact as other guys would have made in 2023. But like I said, in 2024, they'll be better off for it.
So one of the positions they didn't address at all was quarterback, Keith. You thought with Jaxon-Smith's contract, the ability to get out of it, maybe they would address that in this draft. They chose not to. Of course, the obvious reason was that Anthony Richardson went one pick before them at 4 overall, right before Seattle picked. But how do you feel about that? Where do you think that the team is with that thought process?
I think it was Anthony Richardson or CJ Stroud or no one. And then, if Jake Haener continued to fall, he would have been in play, later. But the Saints grabbed him much earlier than I think people thought. And really, that was kind of it. They were either going to take a guy at 5, being Richardson or Stroud, or they weren't going to bother because they've got Geno and they're happy with that. And
I think they do really like Drew Lock. I mean,
they like him as a backup.
We kind of poo-poo that. Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think that they think that he might be able to still develop into something more than just a guy that sits on the bench all the time. He doesn't have that opportunity. Maybe we'll see a little bit more out of training camp. But it seems to me, at least the way that they talk about him, that they view him as something possibly a little more than just that, but we'll see long term. I don't think so, but we'll find out.
I think they like him as a backup because of how he works and how he grinds tape and that kind of stuff. And I think they believe that he can sit and learn and continue to do those things as a backup and maybe take the Jaxon-Smith role and become a better player when he's older and he's more mature. And
that's a good point, Keith.
And have an opportunity to play once he's kind of been humbled a little bit, had a chance to, but have a chance to really become a student and learn the game rather than, just trying to get out there and stuff. So I think that when you say they like him, they do. The way they talk about him, the fact that they brought him back, got him signed really quickly. Yeah, he's a guy that they like, but I don't think they clearly don't view him as someone who's going to compete with Geno this year. Look at their contracts, right? But I think they like him. If Geno gets hurt, they know they've got a guy. And if a couple of years from now they still haven't figured out, what comes after Geno, I think they'll give Locke a shot because at that point he will have done the Jaxon-Smith route where he will have backed up the starter in town for 3+ years and looked like a guy that that people in the locker room trust and look up to and believe in. So Yeah, I think they give him. I think that's kind of his path right now.
Yeah, no, those are all great points. I actually agree with that. All right, let's get out of here. If you're still listening, should have probably mentioned this up at the top of the show. We're on Dan Vian's show tomorrow night to kind of recap the draft with Dan, and on the Seahawks Forever podcast. So make sure you look out for that and listen up if you can. You find us on Twitter at Myers NFL for Keith, myself at NW Seahawk. You can find the show on your favorite podcast platform and our YouTube channel. Make sure you do that and hit that subscribe button. So until next time, go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
Seahawks Playbook podcast listeners, thanks for joining us for another edition of the show. You can find us on Twitter. Bill is at NW Seahawk, Keith is at Myers NFL, and the show is at Hawks Playbook. You can listen and subscribe to the show at SeahawksPlaybook.com.